Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Ilene Simon. Ilene is a certified professional coach and somatic experiencing practitioner who is passionate about helping others explore life with curiosity and exuberance. Her research into somatic experiencing and eating disorders has contributed to the importance of somatic experiencing and body-based therapies in recovery. Ilene has worked extensively with patients suffering from addiction. With master's degrees in exercise physiology and mental health counseling, Ilene blends talking, touch work, and movement to create synergy between a client's body and mind. In addition to her private practice, Ilene has developed a series of trauma healing workshops and lectures, which she hosts worldwide. Ilene lives in Arizona and is the author of Moving Beyond Trauma. Ilene, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Ilene, can you tell our audience what is a somatic experience and how might it be helpful during one's grief journey?
What a great question. Well, somatic experiencing is a body-based therapy modality. And so when you think of therapy, we often think of talk therapy. And somatic experiencing, there is talking, but what we're doing is we're really trying to work with what's happening in the body. So it's more of what we call a bottom-up approach, whereas most talk therapies are top-down, where you're working with your highest level of cognition. So in somatic therapy, you're trying to release the trauma energy that gets stored in the body, because we think of trauma as an event, but it's really about the energy that gets locked in your body around real or perceived threat. So if you go with that line of thinking, then it would make sense that we'd have to bring the body into the healing process. So that's the basics of what somatic experiencing is. And so I like to think of it in the sense of, in order to move past something, we really need to move through it. And we can't move through it until we allow our bodies and the sensory experiences that we're having to be part of that process.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of our listeners are listening in are bereaved. You know, so the trauma they've experienced is the death of someone in their life, and certainly probably in a variety of ways or fashions. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that moving through, and that certainly applies to grief in our lives. And how that happens. I wonder if you could share a little bit about your own experiences in life and how those have kind of come to bear around maybe even the book and some of your work.
Well, it's interesting that you'd ask that, because I do talk about this in the book. About almost 4 years ago, I lost my husband very suddenly. And if it hadn't been for all of the somatic experiencing work that I had done, I don't think I would have moved through it the way I had. I mean, I think I really surprised myself. You know, at any other time in my life, I would not have allowed people to help me. I just wouldn't have allowed for the support. I wouldn't have allowed for the waves of emotions that happen, because it does come in waves. And I felt from the somatic work, I had felt so much safer in my body than I ever had before. And so I wasn't fearful of the experience. I knew that no matter what was going to happen next in my life and the pain that I was going to go through and the pain that I was experiencing, I knew that I'd be okay in the end. And, you know, I really contribute all of that to the work I had done through somatic experiencing, because as a student, I also became a patient of the work. And, you know, for sure, had I not done the work, I would have been in a lot of old behaviors. I struggled with eating disorders for years, and I managed not to go into any of those behaviors. And it was interesting to observe myself allowing myself to be supported by other people. And that was everything. If I had not stayed connected the way I did, I don't think I would have moved through it with, I want to say, a sense of mastery. I don't know if we ever moved through grief with a sense of mastery, but I didn't go, crawl into bed and put the covers over my head and say, I'm not going to go on and live. And I think the big thing is we have to be, if we can find enough safety within ourselves, we can find the strength to continue to live.
You had tools that were ready-made that you yourself had taught and probably used in other instances in your life. A phrase comes to mind, and it is, when we don't know what to do, we do what we know. And I've worked with so many bereaved people over the years that don't have the tools. And so when a death happens, they do what they know, and what they know quite often is crawling back into bed, or is distancing themselves from it, or trying to put it out of their mind, or stay busy, or all the things that we do to attempt to avoid it. And how fortunate that you had those tools, and how fortunate that you're now sharing those tools with other people, because it really is, it's sort of, when we don't know what to do and we do what we know, and what we know doesn't work, we have to find that thing that will work for us, so that we can continue to live.
It's very true. And it's really easy. I mean, I watch so much around me, and I see how easy it is for people to get right back into the maladaptive behaviors, because their nervous systems are starting out from a dysregulated place, and then some big event like this happens, and they're going to do anything they can for that self-soothing. And of course, we know that the maladaptive behaviors in the long run don't work. So yeah, for me, I'm fortunate that I had the tools to help me get through it.
Interesting too, in our field, so often unsupported grief can lead to very bad coping skills, can lead to not understanding why we can't sleep or we can't eat, and could lead to depressive behaviors. But grief is grief, and it is not depression. And to be able to understand that these are normal responses to grief, and then to be able to have this tool, I bet would make a world of difference for so many people who end up down that path of a cycle they just can't seem to get out of, because they don't believe they're grieving when they've never really dealt with their grief.
Oh, no, for sure. And I think that, it's so much, the denial tends to be a defense mechanism, right? It's how that person is going to survive. But what we know with trauma is that if it doesn't get resolved, it's going to show up years later, or another time when you're least expecting it. And, I see this over and over. People think they've moved past the situation, yet to find that something years later or months later, it really triggers them. And, and so even if we can pay attention to that part, if we're not ready to deal with it, immediately, our bodies never lie. That trauma energy does get stored and locked in our body, and it's going to come out when we're least expecting it.
And I love how we're equating trauma with grief, because for many people that don't understand grief, they may default to, well, it's part of life. Death is part of life, and we'll get over it. When in fact, it truly is a traumatic event that can alter the destiny of one's life. It's truly traumatic.
Yes, and I think, the thing to recognize too is that trauma is it's personal to each person. So somebody might be less traumatized by a death than another person. And so a lot of it of how traumatized we are from an event has everything to do with our resources and how much resilience we already have. So if you're starting out and you have let's even take me, for example, I had, my husband died very suddenly. I left my house in the morning, kissed each other goodbye. We had dinner plans that night. And, my entire world got turned upside down. He never made it to his meeting, and my phone kept ringing, and boom, my whole life changed. But because I had done so much work and I had, a lot of resilience and a lot of resources, my recovery was better. And what we know is that the sooner that you can feel safe in the aftermath of a potentially traumatic event, the greater likelihood you're going to have of recovery. And so I share this as such an important point, is that if, bring in your troops, let people help you, allow for support, even if you don't think you need it. Because that sense of safety that you're going to get from that connectivity with other people is going to be the thing that's going to help the event be less traumatic.
Ilene, what would you say to someone, I'm just curious, thinking about, someone who hasn't had those resources, let's say they're years down the road from their loss and they've carried this with them and really haven't known what to do with it. And it's interfering with their everyday life. They just can't seem to pull things together. How does that person begin that process of identifying the things that they can do and the resources they can grab a hold of to help them in their journey?
It's a really good question. I think the first piece of it is being aware and observing what's happening. So, rather than and also to be able to say, okay, it's time. I'm ready for help. I'm ready to do this differently. I think that a good practitioner is going to give that person hope, but it's about finding those nuggets of hope initially so that you can start the process. And I think you have to do it slowly. So if you're a person that's been grieving and you've been totally disconnected from the world, it's about slowly reintroducing yourself to the idea of connection. So I wouldn't say, you go out and you call 10 friends. It may be that you find one safe person that you can connect with that's going to be a person that is going to make you feel safe. And I think I would say this, and I think you do have to white knuckle it a little bit at first and force yourself to go out and do things and get dressed and get out the door, even if you don't feel like it. I had plenty of days at the beginning where I didn't want to get out the door, but I made plans every morning to meet a friend for exercise. And I forced myself to go, and I never felt worse when I had connection. And I think that the big thing I would tell people is you're not going to feel worse with connection, with safe connection.
You were glad you did it after you did it. It was just hard getting to the place of doing it. My mom, when I was a kid, I would tell my mom all the time, I don't want to do whatever she was telling me to do. And she'd say, I didn't ask if you wanted to do it. It's something that you need to do, and as hard as it is to do that for ourselves, sometimes there are just things we need to do. And oftentimes on the other side of it, we're glad we did,
For sure. I like to think of it, it's like you have to think of it as oxygen. This is your lifeline. Okay, without this, you are going to die. If you don't connect and you don't start mobilizing your body, you're not going to make it. You're going to just go deeper and deeper into a hole and not live.
Humans are meant to have connections.
It's our survival. We're pack animals.
Which leads us to this state of the situation that we're all currently in, where we're being told to social distance, right? And I know a lot of people have changed their language. I know Fran and I have, and we have at Heal Grief. We encourage physical distancing, but certainly encourage social connection, right? Because we need to have that in our lives, and otherwise it does impact us. Again, not just mentally and not just socially, but physically.
For sure. I mean, I think that not having social connection is a good point. It stresses our physiology. And when our physiology is stressed, what happens? We get inflammation in our bodies, and inflammation leads to disease. So yeah, it's really important, especially right now as we are, we're in such an awkward time in the world.
So is the somatic experiencing more of a theory, or is there research behind it?
So there's more and more evidence-based research coming online now. But so somatic experiencing was developed by Dr. Peter Levine, and he had studied animals in the wild, trying to understand why animals don't get traumatized and humans do. And what he ultimately figured out is that animals have some sort of biological completion. If you notice, animals shake off the trauma, and that human beings need the same biological completion in their bodies for their nervous system to reset and for them to move on and renegotiate and integrate the trauma back into their bodies. So so there's something called, if you're more interested in learning more about somatic experiencing, obviously you can read my book, but you can also go to the traumahealing.org website and learn about somatic experiencing. And you're asking about the research. Like, I just completed a research project and trying to get a paper published on somatic experiencing for helping eating disorder patients, and we had phenomenal results.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Well, Ilene, I tell you, our time flies on the show all the time. We are short on time, but before we close things out, our listeners probably want to know how they can connect with you and connect with your book, and if there's those who are interested in that, how might they do that?
Well, thank you for asking. So my website is ilenesmith.com, and Ilene is I-L-E-N-E. I'm on Instagram and Facebook, Ilene Smith Trauma Healing. And the book is out May 5th, and it'll be available on Amazon.
Wonderful. And we'll have those links posted on our Let's Talk Death. So Ilene, we want to thank you so much for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death and for sharing your story and your work in somatic experiencing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Great. And we also want to thank those who are joining this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
Make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links to future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And again, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Let's Talk Death.